there, my name is Emily, and this is my work from home colleague, Archie. Thank you so much for joining me today. My project is called Advancing Etopotope, a quantitative comparison of post-secondary Indigenous studies programs. My supervisor is the amazing Dr. Adam Murray. So a little bit about Etopotope. Etopotope is U of C's Indigenous strategy, which was released in 2017. Since then, there has been a reinvigorated responsibility to further indigenization and decolonization. Currently, we have an international Indigenous studies program. But what exactly is Indigenous studies? Current literature does not define it, and existing research only focuses on the integration of Western and Indigenous ways of knowing. So, unfortunately, that means there's a lack of empirical information on Indigenous studies as a discipline. This means that it is difficult to determine whether a program is leading, keeping up with, or falling behind similar programs across Canada and the world. More than ever, I feel it is important that my education here accurately reflects Indigenous ways of knowing. By assessing U of C's Indigenous pedagogies, this project helps implement Etopotope. As well, this project responds to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, specifically number 62, which calls for teacher education on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods into classrooms. The objectives of this project were twofold. First, to determine the core attributes of Indigenous studies. Second, to see how programs vary based off of those attributes. As such, these attributes could be used to inform program design at U of C and other post-secondary institutions. However, the scope of this project is not just limited to Indigenous studies programs, as other disciplines can also learn to indigenize their programs. We started off by developing a codebook through an extensive literature review on Indigenous studies. We then met with U of C's Indigenous Governance Committee to further refine those terms and definitions. Then we made a list of post-secondary institutions with Indigenous studies programs and coded them based on the codebook. During this process, we quantified whether those constructs existed at each institution. Afterwards, an exploratory factor analysis was conducted to consolidate our terms. Finally, we ranked the institutions. 332 post-secondary sites were scanned, with only 238 of them meeting eligibility criteria. For example, the sites had to be in English, and the institution had to offer a major, minor, or graduate program in Indigenous studies. As you can see here, the majority of institutions scanned were American, simply because there are far more American institutions. We also looked at Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand institutions. As well, they were predominantly publicly funded, although private and tribal programs were also represented. The exploratory factor analysis revealed 5 core attributes consolidated from our initial codebook terms: Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, student community, language usage, community member involvement, and research methodologies. You can pause the video here to take a look at the definitions. The exploratory factor analysis allowed us to give scores to sites based on each dimension, as well as an overall score with which to rank the institutions. As such, composite scores were created for each institution. The 238 sites fit into 52 ranks due to ties in the data. As you can see, U of C was one of the schools ranked at number 30. The ranking of schools identifies where U of C is qualified to lead, as well as potential areas for improvement, which will inform program design, recruitment of students and faculty, and hiring or training practices. Although U of C is not a leading school overall, it is doing well in terms of Indigenous ways of knowing. However, there is room for improvement for U of C's Indigenous methodologies and community member involvement. Through comparison with contemporary national and international trends, this project reveals how U of C's Indigenous Studies program can remain relevant to students' interests and professional aspirations. I hope this work will inform decision-making in the interest of supporting long-term impacts. Thank you for your time, and Archie says thanks too.